Rudolf Macúch. Rudolf Macúch, 16 October 1919, in Bzince pod Javorinou, 23 July 1993, in Berlin, was a Slovak linguist, naturalized as German after 1974. He was noted in the field of Semitic studies for his research work in three main areas: one Mandaic studies, two Samaritan studies, and three new Syriac language and literature. Although his scholarly work also covers the far larger range of Arabic and Iranian studies as well as theology and history of religions, most of his monographs and a large number of his numerous articles are dedicated to the study of the languages and literatures of ethnic and religious minorities of the Near East, especially the Mandaeans, Samaritans, and Nestorian Christians. His work is based mainly on extensive field work in various countries of the Middle East, where he personally collected the material used in his studies, thus in many cases preserving the cultural heritage of these minorities from being lost altogether. Biography. Scholarly work. Rudolf Macúch's scholarly work encompasses contributions to a large range of disciplines: one theology and history of religions, two Arabic and Iranian studies, three Semitic studies, with his most important research in three specialities: a Mandaic, the Samaritan, and see New Syriac. Since he employed an interdisciplinary approach in his work, these various fields are so intertwined that it is hardly possible to describe his contributions to them separately without risking repetitions, an attempt which is nevertheless undertaken in the following overview for the sake of theology and religious history. Due to his first field of study, Rudolf Macúch's first publications were dedicated to religious and theological topics, many of which appeared in the Slovak journal Evangelický Teolog. Among these contributions, three articles documenting his early interest in Old Testament studies and comparative religious history may be mentioned here: Marcion's Views of the Old Testament, Marcionov Nazary na Stary Zakon, on the first-century Christian heretic Marcion and his condemnation of the Old Testament, Obadiah's prophecy Proroktovo Abdiasovo. His first published monograph, Islam, a Crescence vo Islam and Christianity, is mainly an introduction to Islamic history and culture, with a chapter on parallel developments in Christianity, which was so well received in the year of its publication that it was reprinted the following year, then repressed during the long communist regime of Antonin Novotny in Czechoslovakia. He returned to the topic of Christianity and Islam towards the end of his life, planning an extensive monograph titled Kritik der monotheistischen Religion, in critique of the monotheistic religions, which remained fragmentary due to his demise and was not published. His continuing interest in religious questions is, however, documented in other publications, in which he repeatedly discussed the texts he was studying also from this perspective, using his philological findings for a better understanding of their historical and cultural context, among others Gnostic, Ethik Undying Fange der Mandaer Gnostic Ethics, and the beginnings of the Mandaeans. Other contributions relevant to this area, especially in connection with the Mandaean religion, can be found in his main fields of research described below: Arabic studies and subjects relevant to Iranian studies. Macúch's dissertation Slovanskmina of Vyrazy u Arabskich Geograph Slavic Names and Expressions in Arabic Geographies is an attempt to read and explain a large range of enigmatic Slavic names and terms in Ar, the material for which he had collected from manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, see vide above. The topic is of utmost interest for Slavic studies, since the oldest of these Arabic geographies were written before the emergence of Slavic literatures. Expressions transmitted in them could therefore contribute to our knowledge of the oldest and even pre-literary levels of the Slavic languages, but the Arabic authors hardly ever noted the terms correctly, leading to numerous problems of reading and interpretation. Although his mentor Bakos and other teachers pressed him to publish this work immediately, he himself was not satisfied with the results and wanted to include different readings from manuscripts which he had not yet consulted. He never published his thesis due to circumstances beyond his command. His focus of interest shifted to other areas, but he returned occasionally to topics in the field of Arabic studies in several important articles, among these Zur Vorgeschichte der Bekenntnisformel, La ilaha illallahu on the prehistory of the creedal statement La ilaha illallahu on the problems of the Arabic translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch, and he was actively involved in establishing an international, interdisciplinary research group on Greco-Arabic topics, thus combining his first interest, classics, with his later vocation. He wrote reports on the conferences of the research group in order to introduce their achievements to the scholarly community, became the honorary president of the Greco-Arabic Society in Delphi, and helped establish a journal dedicated to this field. His own contributions include articles on Greek technical terms, in Arabic sciences, Greek and Oriental sources of Avicenna's and Sorowordi's Theosophies, Pseudo-Callisthenes Orientalis, and the problem of Du el Qarnayn. He also published several articles, most of them in Persian, on subjects relevant to Iranian studies. His first contribution shortly after his arrival in Iran, Nufad-i Zardost dar din Iyad wa Masi, Zarathustra's impact on the Jewish and Christian religions, has already been mentioned above. Another long article in 3 parts is dedicated to specific problems of the Aramaic language, Imperial Aramaic or Right Suramaish in the Achaemenid period. Contributions of later years include Ahamiyat Isami Senesi Bare Iran Senesi, the importance of Semitic studies for Iranian studies, and Sir El Tiranistan onomastic in Aramashir Nebenuberli Forong on Old Iranian onomastics in Aramaic secondary sources. Semitic studies, Mandaic and Mandaeans. Macúch made major contributions to this field, one of his 3 main specialities, to which he dedicated many years of his life. Seeking to study the East Aramaic language of the Mandaeans, a small Gnostic sect living in the Iranian province of Khuzestan, bordering on the Persian Gulf, in Awaz near the Kharan River, he contacted them in 1953. Although it was known that Mandaeans lived in Khuzestan, no one had hitherto tried to consult them in order to check the linguistic and contextual controversies involved in the study of classical Mandaic texts. Macúch undertook the journey in order to study the traditional pronunciation of classical Mandaic, but he discovered to his own surprise that the language was still spoken there as a vernacular dialect, hitherto unknown to Semitists. He was able to make phonetic recordings of the spoken modern dialect, in which classical forms and vocabulary still partly continued, with the help of Nasser Sabari, the ritual slaughterer of the community, and to become acquainted with the traditional pronunciation of the Mandaean priests. Although the modern idiom, being overlaid by foreign influences, especially from Persian and Arabic, differs from the language of the classical Mandaic texts, it was, as Macúch found out, important for understanding the linguistic phenomena of the classical tongue. It served as a guide to the study of the phonetic structure of classical Mandaic and to the traditional pronunciation of the literary and liturgical language. After having received 30 microfilms containing the essential Mandaic literature and related fields from Prof. Romer University of Mainz, he began to analyze the material he had gathered during his field research and to undertake a meticulous comparison of the colloquial and traditional languages. The result of this work was published in his monograph Handbook of Classical and Modern Mandaic, in which he undertakes a parallel description of both idioms. Although this work was already finished by 1955, it took 10 years to be published due to circumstances already mentioned above. See Vita. It was not Macúch's goal to replace Theodore Noldeck's classical Mandaic grammar of 1875, but to complement it, especially in his treatment of Mandaic phonetics on the basis of the modern vernacular. The handbook is an extensive treatment of the topic, in which the phonetics, morphology, and essentials of syntax in both the classic in bold letters and modern idioms in italics are explained, with a large number of examples for every phenomenon. The analysis of the new material also made it possible to divide Mandaic into 3 periods: classical ending with the redaction of the Bzince, ca. 7th century, post-classical, and the modern language, a division which delivers an important key for the critical analysis of Mandaic literature, although a precise limitation of the duration of these periods is not possible. The handbook led to a large number of reviews over the years, 13 of which are discussed extensively by Macúch in a later book dedicated to the memory of Lady Drower, Sir Sprague on Literature der Mandaean. Mandaeans also resided in southern Iraq, where their religion and texts were studied by one of the most prolific authors in this field, Lady Ethelstefana Drower, who was, however, a self-made scholar and felt the need to collaborate with an academic expert in her next enterprise. In 1955, Macúch wrote a critical review of one of Lady Drower's publications, see Vita above, which led to his invitation to Oxford in order to work with her in preparing a Mandaic dictionary. Lady Drower had collected a large number of hitherto unknown manuscripts during her stay in Iraq. The Drower collection of the Bodleian Library, Oxford, hereby laying the foundation for this large work, which was completed by the material recorded by Macúch in Khuzestan and the card index by Mark Lidzbarski for the classical religious texts. The dictionary is therefore based not only on literary sources, but also includes the vocabulary of the vernacular described by Macúch in his handbook and comparative material from other Semitic languages. He also published vast textual material, including both ancient sources and texts in the modern vernacular, demonstrating that already in early times there was a Gnostic literary language attributed to the priests, the Nasorians meaning observers, besides the spoken language of the laity, the Mandaeans. A form closer to the vernacular than the language of the sacred books is preserved in ancient magic texts and formulae from a different sphere of religious beliefs. He dedicated a long article in 2 parts 1967 and 1968 to the decipherment and editing of lead rolls inscribed with Mandaic charms, Alt-Mandaist, Blerol and Old Mandaic lead rolls. The first part discusses the largest lead roll, incised in the smallest scribble hand known so far, containing a row of various charms with noteworthy spelling variants that do not correspond with the standard classic Mandaic orthography. That he was able to read most of it and tried to get some sense out of it can be considered a major achievement, since only 2 very easily legible Mandaic lead rolls had been published so far. The addition of several shorter lead scrolls followed in the second part. His work on new Mandaic texts includes several contributions over the years, beginning with an article in the festschrift of his mentor Jan Baco's The Bridge of Schuster, a legend in vernacular Mandaic with introduction, translation, and notes. In later years, 2 monographs are dedicated to analyzing and preserving new Mandaic texts, Numendaist Chrestomathy mit grammatischer Skis, Kommentierte Übersetzung und Glossar New Mandaic Chrestomathy, with grammatical sketch, annotated translation and glossary, and Numendaist Text im Dialekt von Aues. Both books include extensive chapters on the grammar besides a phonetic transcription of the texts, translation, and glossary. The latter publication was prepared with the help of Sheikh Salem Kohili, a priestly candidate from Alwaz, who had written to Macúch asking him for help in perfecting his knowledge of classical Mandaic, since he had opened a unique Mandaic school for children and adults in Alwaz. Using his sojourn in Berlin in 1990, which was financed by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft DFG, to record texts, Macúch discovered that strange differences exist in the phonetics and morphology of the Kohili tribe in comparison to his earlier source of the 50s, the Sadari tribe. His last monograph discusses these divergent grammatical features based on chosen oral texts recorded in his sessions with the sheikh. His numerous articles in this field are dedicated to several controversially discussed problems, especially regarding the origins of the Mandaeans and their religion in Alter und Heimat des Mandaismus nach Neurschlossen Quellen Age and Homeland of the Mandaeans according to new sources, Anfang der Mandaer, the beginnings of the Mandaeans, zur Frühgeschichte der Mandaer on the early. Other contributions include a concise introduction to Mandaic, an overview on the state of the art, Der Gegenwärtige Stand der Mandaer Forschung und ihre Aufgaben, on the situation of the Mandaean community in Iran after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Ein Newlandischer Brief aus dem Frühjahr 1990 an die Lage der Iran. Samaritan Studies. After his call to the chair of Semitic and Arabic Studies in Berlin in 1963, Macúch dedicated many years to studying the linguistic and literary traditions of another dwindling ethnic minority, the Samaritans of Palestine, who cultivate their own religious customs and have their own liturgy and rites. The Samaritans, well known in the Christian tradition as deviants from mainstream Judaism from the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, accept only their own version of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which differs from the Masoretic text, the authoritative Hebrew text for Rabbinic Judaism. Macúch contacted the Samaritans in Nablus, where their holy place on Mount Gerizim is situated, and spent many months recording the pronunciation of Samaritan Hebrew with the high priest and other priests. He was able to establish the worldwide most extensive specialist library of Samaritan studies, including valuable original manuscripts, microfilms of dispersed manuscripts from various libraries and institutions worldwide, as well as all the monographs and scholarly articles to date at the Institute in Berlin. This collection of material was so unique that it attracted scholars from different regions of the world, even from Jerusalem, the center of Samaritan studies, to work in Berlin. Besides organizing the library, Macúch worked 5 years on his Grammatik des Samaritanischen Hebräisch Grammar of Samaritan Hebrew, which is a thorough treatment of the differences between Samaritan and Jewish Masorian Hebrew in orthography, phonology, morphology, and syntax. As to the pronunciation of Samaritan Hebrew, which is interesting from the point of view of linguistic history, he did not rely on his predecessors Z. Ben Hayim and A. Mertonen, but used his own recordings of texts from his sessions with the Samaritan priests in Nablus. The language is problematic, since the Samaritans were far more flexible in their handling of the sacred text than the Jews, with the result that Samaritan Hebrew manuscripts show not only numerous variants to the Jewish Masoretic text, but also among themselves. The grammar is an especially important contribution to the linguistic history of Hebrew. Macúch's other extensive monograph in this field, his Grammatik des Samaritanischen Aramaic Grammar of Samaritan Aramaic, was an even more difficult task to achieve due to the complicated state of the sources. Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible were translated between the 3rd century BC and the 9th century AD into the colloquial language of Palestine, Aramaic, then enlarged and commented on. No grammatical study of the language of these texts had been hitherto undertaken, since there was still no reliable edition of the Aramaic translation Targum of the Samaritan texts before 1980. The material for this grammar had to be extracted from the original unedited manuscripts. After the critical edition of the first part of the Samaritan Targum books Genesis and Exodus by A. Tal appeared in 1980, Macúch was able to add this material to his own extensive collection from Samaritan Aramaic literature and complete the grammar, another meticulous contribution to linguistic history, giving access to difficult texts important for the study of other Aramaic. Specific linguistic problems of this field were also analyzed in several articles on Der liquide apical und die apical liquide des Samaritanischen Hebräisch, the liquid apical and the apical liquids of Samaritan Hebrew, Zur Grammatik des Samaritanischen Hebräisch, on the grammar of Samaritan Hebrew, Einige Problem der Grammatik des Samaritanischen Aramaic. He gives a broad introduction in Samaritan languages, Samaritan Hebrew, Samaritan Aramaic, and an overview of the state of the art in Der Gegenwärtige Stand der Samaritaner Forschung und ihrer Aufgaben. New Syriac language and literature. Macúch's third major specialty is dedicated to the study of the language and literature of the Nestorian Christians residing in Iran and Iraq, who call themselves Assyrians. His monograph New Syriac Chrestomathy, New Syriac Chrestomathy, conceived together with Estefan Panassi, is the first collection of excerpts and examples from a large range of different literary texts written in New Syriac from various periods, beginning in 1848 up to the 1970s. Most of the texts are written in the dialect of Urmia, others in the dialects of Iraq, Alkoz, and Sanandag. Besides a short grammatical sketch, the book contains a detailed glossary in which all the idioms are taken into consideration. His next major achievement in this field, the monumental Geschichte der Spat on New Syrian Literature History of Late and New Syriac Literature, is the first work on Syriac literature after the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. He had already begun to collect the material for this difficult undertaking years ago in Iran, bringing together the texts from a large range of different literary sources, books, articles, and numerous journals, among these several rare publications, difficult to find at that period and by now completely inaccessible. Besides this material, he used 3 histories of Syriac literature written in Arabic and Syriac. Due to the vast material presented in the book, including an overview of the historical setting of every discussed period, extensive summaries of the literary works, and numerous details on the authors, this work has been greeted as one of the most important scholarly achievements of the past decades in this field. The book fulfills 2 important desiderata. One, it offers an introduction to the hardly known late Syriac literature since the Mongolian invasion in the 13th century, and 2, it presents a unique overview of the huge range of literary works produced in New Syriac, many of which were still completely unknown even to specialists of this field before its publication. 2 other contributions give summaries of the history and literary history of the Assyrians in Iran I, the Assyrian community Assyrian in Iran, Roman II, literature of the Assyrians in Iran, enter Abdon through the ages. Other Aramaic studies. As a scholar with an exceptionally broad range of knowledge in Semitic languages, Macúch also published articles on other topics besides these 3 major fields, especially in the area of comparative Aramaic studies, Gesprochenes Aramaisch und Aramaisch Schriftsprachen, spoken Aramaic and Aramaic written languages, a revised reading of an Aramaic papyrus. Significance of Macúch's work today. Macúch's major publications, his Mandaic handbook and dictionary, his 2 grammars in the field of Samaritan studies, and his history of late and new Syriac literature are standard works of Semitic studies, still indispensable tools for all working in these disciplines today. Despite new findings and scholarly progress in many details over the decades, these works, based on a meticulous analysis of original sources and field research, have not yet been replaced by similarly extensive studies. This may be due to the fact that every new attempt to analyze this vast material would be judged in the scholarly community by the high standards set by Macúch's work. The textual sources presented in his other monographs are major contributions, since they preserve rare material which would otherwise have sunk into oblivion. His field research in these areas has contributed to the preservation of age-old cultural traditions, many of which would have been lost irretrievably in the course of the political turmoil of the past decades in Iran and the Near East. Major publications. For a full list of his publications, see Jan Juras and Daniela Kodajova ed. Slava Esalachitnim Roman III. Glory to the Noble. Liptovsky Mikulas, Spalak Martina Raziusa 2014, pp. 83–88. The bibliography in his festschrift includes his work up to 1989. See Maria Macúch, Christa Muller-Kessler, Bert G. Fragner eds. Studia Semitic and Neknon Iraniker Rudolfo Macúch Septuagenario ab Amicis et Discipulis Dedicata, Wiesbaden, Otto Harrisowitz 1989. pp. Roman 25. Monographs. Islamokrestenstvo. Historica Kulturno Nabozinsk Studio Islam and Christianity, Religious and Cultural Studies on Islam. Nabozinsko Nokna Nizhnika, Library of Religious Sciences. Liptovsky Mikulas Tranosius 1950. A Mandaic Dictionary with E. S. Drower, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1963. Handbook of Classical and Modern Mandaic, Berlin, Walter de Gruyter, 1965. Grammatik des Samaritanischen Hebräisch, Grammar of Samaritan Hebrew, Berlin, Walter de Gruyter, 1969. Studia Samaritana, BD 1. New Syriac Chrestomathy with E. Panasi, New Syriac Chrestomathy Wiesbaden, Otto Harrisowitz, 1974, Porta Linguarum Orientalium NS Zid. Zur Sprach und Literatur der Mandaeer, with Kurt Rudolph and Erich Segelberg on the language and literature of the Mandaeans, Berlin, Walter de Gruyter, 1976, Studia Mandaica I. Geschichte der Svat und Neusyriaischen Literatur, History of Late and New Syriac Literature, Berlin, Walter de Gruyter, 1976. Grammatik des Samaritanischen Aramäisch, Grammar of Samaritan Aramaic, Berlin, Walter de Gruyter, 1982. Studia Samaritana Roman 4. Neumandaische Chrestomathy mit grammatischer Skies, kommentierte Übersetzung und Glossar. Unter Mitwirkung von Klaus Vogel's New Mandaic Chrestomathy, with grammatical sketch, annotated translation and glossary. Wiesbaden, Otto Harrisowitz, 1989, Porta Linguarum Orientalium. New Sarai, BD Exviti. Neumandaische Text im Dialekt von Auwes, with Guido Dankworth. New Mandaic Texts in the Dialect of Auwes. Wiesbaden, Otto Harrisowitz, 1993, Semitic Aviva, Band 12. References